This lecture on healthy eating is taken from Chapter 1 of the nutrition textbook, Nutrition Revolution. This lecture is a subsection of Chapter 1, and it looks at specifically healthy eating principles. In light of the historical impact of the Industrial Revolution on the processing of our food supply, it's really important at this stage of the lecture to look at the principles of healthy eating that we need to currently be considering, given the abundance of fast food and snack foods that have currently invaded our national food inventory. With such an availability of really poor quality food, high in fat, sugar, and salt, is there any wonder why we're not getting fatter and sicker? At a very basic level, the CDC behavioral food surveillance system confirmed back in the 90s that about 77% of adult Americans were eating fewer than the minimum 5 servings of fruit and vegetables that are recommended for good health. Instead, we're faced with an onslaught of a variety of foods high in sugar and fat that taste so amazing. How can we even consider wise, healthy food choices when our taste buds have been held captive by a highly processed food industry and scheduled lifestyles that no longer make the family meal a possibility? I encourage you to stop the video here and to go into D2L, where you can click on the video, The Price Pottinger Story. And this will give you a second perspective on the impact of a highly processed diet on human health. So as a population, we're guided by the U.S. Food Guide. The ChooseMyPlate.gov is the location of the Choose My Plate Food Guide, which teaches the population about the proportionality of foods that should be part of a regular diet. The takeaway is that 3/4 of our plate should be grains, fruits, and vegetables, and 1/4 should be focused on protein foods, no longer just meats and meat substitutes. Now, the content of the food guide is based on the healthy eating guidelines that are put forth by the Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and by Health and Human Services. Now, we're looking here at the current healthy eating guidelines for Americans, and we can see that there are some key objectives to pay attention to that are recommended for the population. Well, the first goal is to follow healthy dietary patterns at every age, with a focus for the first 6 months of life, which should be exclusive breastfeeding, and then the introduction of solid foods of various types that are healthy around 6 months of age, and then really to focus on nutrient-dense foods and beverages that are culturally appropriate and consistent with the traditions, and then also to focus on nutrient food groups, basically, and meeting the requirements for a variety of these food groups. And of course, they put emphasis here on vegetables and fruits, grains, dairy foods, protein foods, and oils, and limit foods and beverages that are high in added sugar, saturated fat, sodium, and to limit alcohol intake to basically 2 drinks for men and 1 drink for women per day. So when we look at added sugar, we can see less than 10% of the DRI calories from age 2 and up. Saturated fat is less than 10%. Sodium is less than 2,300 milligrams per day. And essentially, these guidelines have not changed in several decades. And this is because the population struggles to attain these objectives because of poor food choices. Well, what's the main takeaway? Ensure that the vegetables you're taking are colorful, deep in color. Make sure the dairy products are low fat. Ensure the grains are whole grain. And make sure your proteins are of various types, including legumes, not just meats. Here's the focus behind the dietary guidelines for Americans, which are really aimed at building a healthy base. So the key principles is certainly to provide dietary balance adequacy in energy and in nutrients. So meet the recommended intake within energy needs by adopting a balanced eating pattern, such as the USDA food guide. Now ensure nutrient density and consume for this nutrient-dense foods and beverages within and among the basic food groups, while choosing foods that are limited in the content of saturated fat and trans fats, limiting in cholesterol, in added sugar and salt, and in alcohol. Consult the executive summary of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2015 to 2020, and this is put out by the Department of Health and Human Services and the United States Department of Agriculture. So it's a joint effort to guide the population, provide them with, these key principles that we should be looking at.
Now, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans really is a practical approach to implementing Healthy People Guidelines 2030, and these guidelines are created every decade. Looking over the Healthy People Guidelines 2030, you can see that there's an overlap with healthy eating guidelines. Here, the Healthy People puts emphasis on reducing food insecurity in the family and in children, but they put the same emphasis, you can see, on fruits and vegetables and fat consumption and sodium consumption. There are specific limits that are very similar as well. In addition to eating healthy oils, reducing added sugar and so forth, and ultimately reducing the prevalence of obesity in the population overall, and specifically iron deficiency in women that are 12 to 49, of course, iron deficiency in children as well.
We should also have a good knowledge about how to distribute carbohydrates, protein, and fat in our diet. We call these the acceptable macronutrient ranges. Now, for carbohydrate, that's 45 to 65% of the total recommended calories. So the total possible limit here is 65%. And of that 65%, you can break the carbohydrates down as follows: 25% from fruit, vegetables, and milk, and about 40% from breads and cereals. Hopefully, most would be whole grains. The second recommendation is for the acceptable macronutrient range for protein, and the range is 10 to 35% of DRI calories, which are really recommended calories. Next would be the acceptable macronutrient range for fat, and that's 20 to 35% of DRI calories. So now let's take a practical approach to creating a healthy distribution of macronutrients. So for example, if the total daily caloric requirement of an individual is 2,500 calories, and if 65% of those calories are going to be carbohydrate, how many grams is that equal to? Now the hint we start off with is 1 gram of carb is 4 calories. So then if we're going to calculate this out, we would say 0.65, which is really 65 over 100, or 65%. So 0.65 times 2,500 calories equals 1,625 calories. But we shouldn't stop there. We need to get the number of grams. So the next step is to take the 1,625 calories, divide that by 4 calories per gram, and we end up with 406 grams of carbohydrate. Let's do a similar calculation for protein. So if we aim for 15% of our calories as protein, which according to the World Health Organization meets the needs of most individuals on the planet, how many grams does that equal to? Again, the hint is 1 gram of protein is equal to 4 calories also. So here's what the calculation looks like. It's 0.15, or again 15%, or 15 over 100, so that's 0.15 times 2,500. That gives you 375 calories. Now we need to convert the calories into grams. Next, the 375 calories gets divided by 4 calories per gram, and we end up with 93.75,
which we could round up to 94 grams of protein. Let's do a similar calculation for fat. And let's use 20% of our calories as fat. And notice that as we use these different percentages, at the end, you have to add the percentages from fat, from protein, and from carbohydrates together so that they add up to 100. So make sure you do that at the end of your calculation. So how many grams does that equal to? 20% of 2,500 calories. Remember, here the hint is that 1 gram of fat is equal to 9 calories. So now we've got 0.20 times 2,500, and that equals 500 calories. And of course, the next step is to convert the 500 calories into grams. So in this final step, the 500 calories then is divided by 9 calories per gram. We get 55.55, or you can round that up to 56 grams of fat. So be sure to practice these calculations, maybe working on a tentative attempt at least at creating a diet for your parents or for your roommate, and do some calculations like this that make you a little more comfortable at executing these calculations expediently and efficiently. Now, the diet that is currently being espoused by the American Medical Association's physicians, the dietitians, the nutritionists, that has a 500-year history of healthy eating and low morbidity is the Mediterranean diet. In our food guide, we've placed 1/4 of the plate as protein foods, no longer identifying it as meat. Now, the Mediterranean diet has historically always maintained the meat at the top of the pyramid, the same place that historically when we had a pyramid, we had sweets and fats. So they put meat at the top, meaning that it should only be consumed monthly, but it can be consumed. It's not absolutely restricted. What we see on a weekly basis, though, is just a little bit of sweets, but mostly, eggs and poultry and fish consumed on a weekly basis. We're looking at cheese and oils and fruits, vegetables, and legumes on a daily basis. So a great deal of focus placed on the kinds of products that we don't really see a lot of in our current diet. And that is certainly, the nuts and the legumes. More emphasis needs to be placed on that if we're going to orient our diet to the Mediterranean style. And of course, the whole base is breads and pastas and rice and couscous. And that's, of course, very, very important. But very interestingly, the whole foundation of the diet is based on physical activity, which, of course, encompasses the whole concept of diet and lifestyle in a very good way. And we also find a similar guide to the Mediterranean diet, and that is the Asian diet pyramid. Note the similarities. The meat at the top for monthly consumption, sweets occasionally on a weekly basis, eggs and fish, and of course vegetable oils there, and then fruits and legumes and vegetables, different types of vegetables than the Mediterranean, but we can still see nevertheless the focus on legumes, and then of course the rice and noodles and breads at the base, with the whole foundation being physical activity. So a very similar distribution. And of course, the Asian diet is also associated with a long history of good health and low morbidity.